My younger sister sat across from me with a victorious smile, certain her forged documents would strip me of my $100 million business. My parents called me the family disgrace, and a failure, while I built my empire from scratch. They thought I'd come crawling back on my knees, but instead, they found themselves in the defendant's chair. Watch until the end, and you'll see how the golden child earned a federal felony instead of my inheritance. At the hearing, my younger sister had gone so far as to hire her own counsel just to prove I was destitute. My parents sat across from me, claiming they had handed me every possible advantage, only for me to squander it all. My mother began to weep, the sound echoing through the sterile room, while my father merely nodded, his face a mask of grim, calculated disappointment. My own lawyer, Marcus Thorne, remained perfectly still until Judge Miller paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the documents. "I have reviewed the asset and tax records," the judge said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Someone in this courtroom is lying to my face." My mother, Beatrice Sterling, continued her dramatic display, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that remained perfectly dry. We were in a federal courtroom in Denver, and the air was thick with the weight of their accusations. Beside her, my father, Arthur Sterling, sat with his jaw clenched, watching as their attorney laid out a trail of fabricated papers claiming I owed my younger sister, Clara, $2 million. I am Elena Vance, the founder and CEO of Eon Resource Systems. That afternoon, I sat at the defense table in a charcoal wool suit, my expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Clara's lawyer spoke with practiced confidence, spinning a tale of a company on the brink of collapse. He argued that my firm was unable to repay a massive internal family investment, and that the court needed to intervene to protect Clara, as a primary creditor. The gallery leaned in. Clara sat perfectly upright, a faint, triumphant smile ghosting across her lips. Then, Judge Miller stopped reading the petition. He removed his spectacles, scanned the newly submitted tax records with newfound intensity, and looked up. "I've reviewed the records," he repeated, his voice echoing. "Someone in this courtroom is lying to me." Clara's smile vanished. My mother's orchestrated sobbing ceased instantly. My father froze. I simply sat there, silent and composed, waiting for the moment I had spent 10 years preparing for. The roots of this betrayal reached back to our family estate in the foothills of Colorado, where the Sterlings had built an empire on land acquisition and high-end resort development. My father owned one of the most powerful firms in the Rockies, a man who turned mountain vistas into multi-million-dollar gated communities. He had started with a single timber contract and expanded aggressively, using every connection to shape the landscape of the West. Beatrice focused on the family's social architecture. She chaired the most exclusive boards and ensured the Sterling name was synonymous with Denver's old money elite. From the start, Clara was the chosen one. Born nearly a decade after me, she was the darling of the household, receiving the kind of mentorship I was never offered. I remember a summer when she was only 16. Father took her to a high-stakes negotiation at a private club, introducing her as the future of Sterling Enterprises, while the board members laughed and toasted to her health. "She has the killer instinct," he would say, patting her hand. "She'll take this firm further than I ever could." He provided her with everything: private tutors, luxury vehicles, and internships where she shadowed him through every closed-door meeting. He made sure the industry giants knew her name before she even graduated high school. He saw in Clara the perfect heir, someone who possessed the right blend of charm and ruthlessness to maintain the status quo. I had chosen a different path. After finishing my undergraduate degree, I briefly enrolled in law school, thinking it might earn my father's respect. But during my second year, I became consumed by the potential of sustainable technology. I saw a future where software could monitor mountain ecosystems in real time, preventing the very environmental degradation my father's projects often caused. I spent my nights building models for tracking snowpack melt, soil stability, and migratory patterns. When I turned 25, I walked into my father's mahogany-lined office and presented a business plan for Eon Resource Systems. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old leather. He flipped through the pages, chuckling before he even reached the projections. "It's a nice little hobby, Elena," he said, tossing the binder onto his desk. "But it's a fantasy. This tech isn't a real asset. Stick to what works. Stick to the land." He leaned back in his chair, gesturing to the sprawling view of the city below. "Come work here properly. Be the legal support Clara needs. She's the one who will lead the core business. Keep it in the family." I pushed back, explaining the rising demand for environmental compliance and federal resource management. "There is a massive market for this, Dad. It's not just an experiment. It's the future." He shook his head, his smile fading into that cold, familiar stare. "You're throwing away a legacy for computer nonsense. Clara understands what matters. Help her build it, or go chase these ghosts until you're broke." The argument that followed was the final fracture. My mother joined in, mourning the potential blow to our social standing, while Clara listened from the doorway with a quiet, satisfied glint in her eyes. "I won't spend my life as a footnote in her story," I told them. "I'll do this on my own." My father's final words were like ice. "Fine. But when you fail, and you will, don't think you can crawl back. You'll take whatever scrap of a job Clara is generous enough to offer you." I walked out of that house and never looked back. I packed my life into an old hatchback and moved into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Rent took nearly everything I had, but it gave me a view of the peaks that reminded me why I started. Those early months were a blow of isolation. I taught myself to code, fueled by black coffee and the desperate need to prove them wrong. I lived on the edge of my savings, writing reports for small nonprofits, just to keep the lights on while I built the first prototype of the Eon platform. It was a long, lonely road, but I was no longer playing second fiddle. I was finally the architect of my own life. "You should be supporting Clara," my father said, his voice flat and final. "She is the one who will inherit the foundation of this company. You have a law degree, use it to protect our interests. Keep the legacy within the family." I didn't back down. I explained the shift in the industry, the new federal mandates for environmental transparency, and the massive untapped market for sustainable land management. "There is real capital in these solutions, Dad. This isn't some graduate school experiment. It's a necessity." He shook his head, his small, condescending smile vanishing into a look of stern disappointment. "You're trading a secure future for digital vaporware. Clara understands what it means to build something that lasts. Go ahead, chase your fantasies. Just don't expect me to watch you go broke." The argument only grew more bitter. My mother chimed in, her primary concern, as always, being the family's image. She fretted over what the neighbors at the club would say if they found out their eldest daughter had walked away from the family firm to play with startups. Clara, home for the weekend, sat in the corner of the room. She didn't say a word, but the smug, satisfied glint in her eyes told me everything. Her position was safe. I was the outlier. "I'm not coming back to be an assistant to my own sister," I said, my voice steady despite the heat in the room. "I'll build this on my own terms." My father's final words were like a door slamming shut. "Fine. But when this fails, and it will, you will crawl back here. And you will take whatever entry-level position Clara is kind enough to offer you." I walked out of his office, through the grand foyer of the estate, and into the cold mountain air. I never asked for their blessing, or a single cent of their money again. The silence that followed as I drove away felt permanent. I moved into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Boulder, right where the suburban sprawl gives way to the jagged terrain of the foothills. The walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors' televisions, and the kitchen was a relic of the 70s, but the window in the living room looked directly at the peaks. It was a constant reminder of why I was fighting. Rent consumed half of my meager savings in the first month. My life narrowed down to a single focus. I taught myself to code from scratch, spending 16 hours a day hunched over a second-hand laptop, moving from basic Python tutorials to complex geospatial libraries. My nights were spent buried in federal regulations, Department of the Interior guidelines, and environmental impact statements. I printed out thousands of pages of public land policies, highlighting every requirement for resource monitoring until my fingers were stained with ink. Money became a ghost. I took on soul-crushing freelance work, writing technical reports for small environmental firms, just to pay for groceries and high-speed internet. Coffee was my only luxury, sleep was a secondary concern. The constant whir of my laptop fan was the only sound in the apartment as I developed the first prototype, an application that synthesized satellite imagery with ground-level sensor data to predict erosion and landslide risks on public trails. That prototype was my only hope. I eventually connected with a man through an industry forum, someone who claimed to have deep ties to outdoor tech investors. We met at a nondescript coffee shop in Golden. He seemed genuinely impressed, offering to help me secure a seed round if I shared my technical architecture and code repository for his team to audit. I trusted him. We shook hands, and I sent him everything. 2 weeks later, he stopped answering my calls. A month after that, I saw my exact interface and my proprietary algorithms being showcased at a regional tech summit under his new company's banner. He had taken my work, filed for a provisional patent, and erased me from the narrative entirely. I had $15,000 left when it happened. The theft left me with nothing but a trail of emails that weren't legally binding enough to win a fight against a man with better lawyers. But I didn't quit. I spent the next 4 months rewriting the entire core of the system from memory. I made it faster. I added a machine learning layer that could forecast water runoff with far greater accuracy than the version he'd stolen. I lived on instant noodles and pure spite, applying for every STEM grant I could find. Most were rejected because I didn't have a proven track record. The second blow hit even harder. I had managed to hire a single part-time contractor and secured a meeting for a pilot project with the Regional Forest Service office. The plan was to deploy our sensors across a high-risk section of the backcountry to provide real-time avalanche data. I poured every cent I had left into the field equipment, driving into winter storms to install the prototypes myself, my hands numb as I calibrated the sensors against the wind. The rejection arrived in a formal, cold letter. They praised the innovation, but deemed the project too early stage for a federal partnership, citing a lack of long-term trial data. Overnight, my contractor left for a stable job at a larger firm. The 2 investors I had finally lined up saw the rejection and pulled their term sheets. My bank account dipped below $1,000. For the first time, I sat in that dark apartment staring at an eviction notice, wondering if my father had been right all along. I sat in that dim apartment, the red ink of the eviction notice blurred before my eyes, wondering for the first time if my father had been right. That year, Beatrice still sent the annual Thanksgiving invitation, tradition, she called it. I drove to the family estate one last time, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The table was a monument to excess, the turkey carved with surgical precision, everyone dressed in their holiday finery. The conversation remained shallow until Clara, home from university for the break, looked at me with that sharp, practiced confidence she had inherited from our father. "So, how is the little tech project coming along?" she asked, her voice light. Father says these startups usually burn out within the first 18 months. The words hit exactly where she intended. I looked around the table, seeing only polite, expectant silence. No one defended me. They simply waited to see if I would break. Something snapped quietly inside me in that moment. I finished the meal in silence, thanked them for the hospitality, and walked out of the house before the first pie was even sliced. On the drive back toward the foothills, I made a choice. No more letters. No more holiday visits. No more energy wasted on people who were rooting for my failure. From that night on, Eon became my entire world. The isolation was a gift. It sharpened my focus until nothing else existed but the code and the data. The turning point was quiet. A modest contract with the Colorado Division of Wildlife to monitor riparian habitats along the Eagle River. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hire my first full-time developer and rent a tiny, sun-drenched office in a brick building downtown. We refined the platform, integrating LiDAR data for precision modeling and partnering with state universities to validate our research on watershed health. Word began to spread through agency circles. Soon, we were running pilot programs for the Department of Natural Resources near Aspen and Telluride. The system proved its worth. We provided real-time alerts on trail erosion, water quality shifts, and illegal land use that satellite images alone couldn't catch. Revenue grew steadily, allowing us to expand the team to 20 people and move our servers to a high-capacity facility. During this phase, I married Julian. We had a quiet ceremony in Vail, surrounded only by a few close friends and colleagues. From that day on, I used Vance as my professional name. It wasn't about hiding. It was about creating a clean break from the sterling legacy and the baggage that came with it. In technical journals and business reviews, I was Elena Vance, CEO of Eon Resource Systems. No one connected the dots back to the family I had left behind. The breakthrough arrived after 3 years of relentless work and a dozen trips to Washington. Eon won a $100 million multi-year contract with the Bureau of Land Management to deploy our AI monitoring system across mountain zones nationwide, from the Rockies to the High Sierras. The scale was staggering. We were installing sensor networks and providing real-time dashboards for federal decision-makers on everything from wildfire risk to grazing permits. The media coverage was immediate. A feature in a major business quarterly hailed Eon as the savior of public land stewardship. National outlets picked up the story, praising the innovative use of machine learning for conservation. I accepted awards on stages as Elena Vance, watching the company's valuation soar. Across town, at the Sterling estate, Clara heard my father mention a new obstacle during a dinner discussion. He was complaining about a firm named Eon, led by a woman named Vance, whose environmental monitoring requirements were complicating his latest resort development timelines. These new federal contractors are making the old ways impossible, he grumbled, unaware of the irony. Clara noted the name. Later that night, alone in her room, she searched the federal contract databases out of habit, always looking for an edge in the family business. The BLM award announcement was at the top of the results. Elena Vance. It took her only minutes to cross-reference the founding documents and old news clippings. The realization was a physical blow. This was my work, built from nothing, now overshadowing their entire legacy. As she watched the headlines celebrating my success, her own role in my father's aging business model felt suddenly, dangerously fragile. Partners were already starting to ask my father why he wasn't adopting similar technology to stay competitive, and the pressure was building. Clara began planting the seeds of doubt during their Sunday dinners, suggesting that my success was a house of cards. She whispered that federal contracts were notoriously fickle, often overhyped and easily rescinded. My mother listened with a sympathetic sigh, while my father grumbled about the arrogance of upstart firms disrupting established markets. Then, Clara proposed a solution framed as a gesture of protective concern. She reminded them of $2 million that had been moved through her accounts years ago, funds originally intended as a family safety net. She argued that, given my current solvency, the money should be reclaimed as an unpaid loan. It took some time to convince them, but the narrative fit their worldview perfectly. I was a wayward daughter, who needed to be reined in for the sake of the family reputation. Clara took the lead, finding a litigator willing to file a claim based on fabricated records and forged signatures. The plan was to force Eon Resource Systems into involuntary bankruptcy, triggering a level of judicial scrutiny that would freeze our operations and derail the national rollout before anyone realized the stability of our actual finances. The blow landed on a Tuesday morning. A heavy manila envelope arrived at the office, marked for my immediate attention. I opened it at my desk, expecting a routine compliance audit. Instead, I found a bankruptcy petition filed against Eon, claiming the company was insolvent and owed a primary creditor $2 million. The name on the filing was Clara Sterling. A cold sickness settled in my chest. I scanned the attached documents, a loan agreement dated years back with a signature that looked disturbingly like my own, and financial statements depicting massive losses that bore no resemblance to our books. It was a fiction, a family-backed investment supposedly routed through Clara's personal accounts for tax purposes, now declared in default. Disbelief gave way to a sharp, cold anger. My own sister had gone this far. I had built Eon without a single dollar from them, yet here was a forged paper trail designed to bring it all down. I called Marcus Thorne immediately. He had managed our federal compliance since the early days and knew the company's anatomy better than anyone. I scanned the filing and sent it over while we were still on the line. "This is a surgical strike, Elena," Marcus said, his voice tight with professional indignation. "The signatures are forgeries, the accounts are invented, and the timeline is a work of fiction. We can dismantle this with our audited statements alone." He paused, the silence on the line heavy with implication. "But there's a catch. The filing itself is a public grenade. Even if it's dismissed, the record remains. It could trigger secondary reviews from our partners at the Bureau of Land Management, delay our funding disbursements, or spook the private equity firms we've been talking to. And in Denver, the old money networks are deep. If the judge has any ties to the Sterling name, they could drag this out just to save your father's face." His warning was a bucket of ice water. Denver's business elite was a small, interconnected circle where reputations were traded like currency. A prolonged case could stall our nationwide expansion at the exact moment we needed to be moving fastest. I drove home early that day, my mind racing through every possible defensive move. Julian was in the kitchen, and he knew the moment he saw my face that the world had changed. I handed him the papers. He read them in a silence that grew more suffocating with every page. "This is madness," he said finally, looking up. "Your own sister is trying to liquidate you after everything you've achieved." We sat at the kitchen table late into the night. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, especially the realization that Clara was using our family history as a weapon to dismantle my life's work. Julian worried about the practical fallout, the sensor deployments scheduled across 4 states, the new engineers we were onboarding, the looming grant milestones. Any hold on our accounts could force layoffs and destroy the credibility we had spent a decade building. We decided on an aggressive, no-holds-barred defense. Over the next week, Marcus coordinated a comprehensive response package. We pulled audited financials from a Big Four firm showing our healthy reserves and rapid growth. We hired forensic handwriting experts to compare the signatures on the petition against dozens of my legal samples. They concluded there was no match. We mapped every bank record from both my personal and corporate accounts, proving that not a single cent had ever been transferred from a sterling source. Julian helped organize the timelines, pulling old emails and tax filings to prove I had been entirely self-funded since the day I left. We even gathered affidavits from my earliest team members to confirm the company's origins. The morning of the hearing arrived, cold and bright. I walked into the federal building downtown with Marcus at my side, carrying boxes of evidence that could sink a ship. Across the aisle, my family entered as a coordinated unit. Clara led the way, dressed in a sharp, expensive blazer, whispering instructions to her lawyer with a series of confident nods. She looked like she had already won. Beatrice was dressed in a study of somber elegance, her expression carefully curated to project the pained disappointment of a mother betrayed. Beside her, Arthur sat perfectly erect, the image of a weary patriarch forced to sweep up the mess of a wayward child. The hearing began with Clara's attorney rising dramatically, painting a picture of reckless mismanagement and a debt that had been ignored for far too long. "We are looking at a case of blatant disregard for a $2 million internal family loan," the lawyer said, gesturing toward us with practiced indignation. My client provided generous support for what she believed were legitimate business purposes, only to be shut out once the company found success. I watched the performance with a steady pulse, though a cold anger simmered beneath my composure. Marcus remained still, waiting for his moment. The courtroom filled with a low hum of voices, the rustle of heavy bond paper, and the occasional dry cough from the gallery. I took my place at the defense table, Julian's hand resting lightly over mine in a silent show of support. Marcus sat on my other side, his stacks of exhibits organized with surgical precision. Across the aisle, Clara had entered first, her lawyer trailing her like a shadow. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, and carried herself with the same chilling confidence she displayed at family dinners. Beatrice followed in a dark silk dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue before the first word was even spoken. Arthur came last, his posture rigid. He gave the impression of a man who found the entire proceeding beneath him, yet necessary for the family's honor. The bailiff called the session to order, and Judge Miller took the bench. Clara's attorney stood immediately, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "Your Honor, the petitioner, Clara Sterling, seeks immediate bankruptcy protection regarding Eon Resource Systems. The firm is fundamentally insolvent, having failed to repay a $2 million loan advanced years ago through a private family arrangement. My client has suffered significant financial harm, while the respondent continues to hide behind recent federal contracts." He gestured toward a stack of documents. "We have the loan agreements, the promissory notes, and correspondence showing the debt was acknowledged. The company's current revenue does not erase its underlying default." Beatrice let out a soft, choked sob at the mention of financial distress. Arthur gave a slow, solemn nod of agreement. Clara kept her gaze fixed forward, her lips pressed into a thin line of righteous certainty. Marcus remained seated, his expression neutral, letting them finish their scripted performance. When the attorney finally sat down, Judge Miller leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "Counsel for the respondent," the judge prompted. Marcus rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we have filed a comprehensive response and a request to dismiss this petition with prejudice. Before we proceed with arguments, I ask the court to review the supplemental asset and tax records we submitted late yesterday." Judge Miller nodded to the clerk. A heavy silence descended over the room as he flipped through the new pages. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Suddenly, he stopped. He removed his glasses, set them on the bench, and looked directly at the Sterling table. "I have reviewed the asset and tax records," Judge Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Someone in this courtroom is lying to my face." Clara's shoulders stiffened. Beatrice's tissue froze mid-air. Arthur's jaw tightened. Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. Your Honor, we have three primary pieces of evidence that demonstrate this petition is a fabrication. He signaled to the clerk, and the first exhibit appeared on the monitors. First, the signatures on the alleged loan documents do not match any known samples of Elena Vance's handwriting. Forensic analysis by a certified examiner shows clear discrepancies in stroke patterns and pressure. Every single signature provided by the petitioner is a forgery. He clicked to the next slide. Second, the claimed investment date falls during Clara Sterling's sophomore year of college. Bank records from that period show she possessed no such capital, nor were there any outgoing transfers of that magnitude from her accounts. Finally, the third slide appeared. The account number listed as receiving the funds has never existed in any bank records associated with Eon Resource Systems or the Sterling family. It appears to have been entirely invented for the purpose of this filing. Julian squeezed my hand. I felt his steady presence as the color drained from Clara's face. The confident tilt of her chin vanished. Beatrice's orchestrated sobbing stopped as if a switch had been flipped. Arthur stared straight ahead, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. Judge Miller set the documents aside. Mr. Thorne, do you have anything further? Marcus shook his head. That is the essence of it, Your Honor. This petition contains no legitimate debt, and no basis for relief. We ask the court to dismiss with prejudice, and refer the matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for investigation into bankruptcy fraud and criminal interference with a federal contractor. Judge Miller looked across the room, his gaze landing heavily on Clara. The court finds the petition lacks merit, and is built upon fabricated evidence, he declared. The case is dismissed with prejudice. The clerk is directed to forward all materials to the U.S. Attorney's Office for appropriate action. This court will not be used as a tool for fraud or personal vendettas. The gavel came down with a final, echoing crack. Clara sat frozen, her eyes wide with a shock that had finally turned into fear. Beatrice stared at the floor, while Arthur's hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. Marcus turned to me with a small, relieved nod. Julian exhaled, his grip on my hand loosening for the first time all morning. The weight of the last 10 years didn't disappear, but it shifted. The courtroom began to clear, but I knew the real consequences for the Sterlings were only just beginning. Federal investigators moved with terrifying efficiency once the referral landed on their desks. They began with Clara's attorney, laying out the evidence of fraud and the certainty of his disbarment if he refused to cooperate. Faced with the end of his career, he didn't hesitate to turn over everything, emails, draft documents, and recordings of meetings where Clara had meticulously outlined the plan. She had framed the entire scheme as a necessary intervention to protect the family interests from my supposed impending collapse. The full picture was undeniable. Clara had orchestrated every detail, from the forged loan papers to the exact lines my parents were supposed to deliver in court. The prosecutors built a granite-solid case for bankruptcy fraud, perjury, and criminal interference with a federal contractor. Clara's options evaporated overnight. To avoid a lengthy trial and the maximum sentence, her attorney negotiated a plea. She accepted a term of probation and a permanent federal felony record that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The substantial fines drained her personal accounts, but the true blow came from within the house. Arthur, finally seeing the extent of the damage to his own reputation, formally revised his estate and succession plans. He removed Clara from every executive role and stripped her of her inheritance. The golden child was gone. The fallout didn't stop with Clara. News of the scandal rippled through Colorado's tight-knit development circles. Major clients, developers with massive resort projects in the works, began demanding audits of their existing partnerships. Several pulled out entirely, citing the reputational risk of being associated with the Sterling name. Local banks, reading the press reports, tightened their credit lines. My father spent months trying to stabilize the firm, but cash flow withered as his deals stalled. Within a year, a key joint venture in Aspen collapsed when the other side invoked a morality clause. Revenue plummeted. Arthur aged 10 years in a matter of months, working grueling hours to salvage relationships that had taken half a century to build. Eventually, with no viable path toward recovery, he was forced to accept a buyout from a larger regional competitor. He sold the company for a fraction of its former valuation. The sterling name, once the gold standard of mountain development, vanished from the landscape. 8 months after the plea, a letter arrived from Beatrice. It was handwritten on heavy cream-colored stationery, 12 pages of self-justification. She wrote about her fear that the tech world was ruining me and how Clara had convinced them that a legal intervention was the only way to bring me home. Phrases like, "We only wanted what was best," and "family should stand together in the dark times," filled the pages. There was no apology, only a faint regret that things had escalated. I read it once and set it aside. I didn't reply. The final confrontation took place in the courthouse hallway immediately following the sentencing confirmation. My family was huddled near a bench, speaking in hushed, broken tones. Clara looked smaller than I had ever seen her, her eyes fixed on the floor. Beatrice clutched a ball of damp tissues. Arthur stood with his shoulders slumped, his shadow a fragment of what it once was. I approached with Julian at my side. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling, Clara," I said, the formality of their names hanging like frost in the air. Beatrice flinched. Arthur met my eyes for a fleeting second before looking away. "I assume you understand your roles in this now," I continued, my voice even. "The forgery, the perjury, the attempt to destroy everything I built." Arthur cleared his throat. "Elena, it was mostly—" "Don't," I cut him off. "Clara led the way, but you chose to follow. You chose to believe I would fail rather than admit you were wrong about me." "We thought we were protecting you," Beatrice whispered. "Protection doesn't involve fraud in a federal courtroom," I said. "The consequences you're facing now belong to you alone." Clara finally looked up, her voice a thin rasp. "I didn't think it would go this far." "But it did," I replied. "And I'm finished. Don't contact me again. Don't reach out to Julian or anyone at Eon. We are no longer family in any way that matters." We walked away, and no one followed. That hallway was the end of the line, no more invitations, no more letters, no more pretense. Eon expanded rapidly once the shadow of the lawsuit was gone. We opened new offices in Denver and Boise to support our field teams across federal lands. Our staff grew to over 200 people, engineers, data scientists, and policy experts who believed in the mission of balancing conservation with responsible development. New contracts followed, totaling billions over multi-year terms as our system became the national standard for resource management. Julian and I designed our own home, a modern glass and stone sanctuary nestled in the foothills, with windows that framed the peaks of the Continental Divide. We moved in just before Presley arrived, a healthy, bright-eyed girl with dark hair and a curious spirit. Life settled into a rhythm of board meetings, family dinners, and quiet evenings watching the sun dip behind the mountains. I often held Presley in the nursery at dusk, rocking her as she drifted toward sleep. The room smelled of lavender and fresh linens, the soft light filtering through the curtains. One evening, as she gripped my finger with surprising strength, I whispered stories to her, not fairy tales of princesses, but truths about the cost of chasing what matters. "You'll try things that scare you," I told her softly. "And some people might say it's impossible or unwise. But the ones who matter will cheer for every step you take, even the ones where you stumble." She cooed, her eyes half closed. I thought about the team celebrations after our contracts, the late nights that turned into laughter, the the colleagues who reached out because they genuinely cared. Those were the people I chose to build a life with. No word ever came from the Sterlings again. The silence was absolute, and I welcomed it. Presley would never know the burden of conditional love, or the sting of favoritism. Her world would be one of encouragement, a place where she was free to explore, fail, and try again with unwavering support. I placed her in the crib, and watched the steady rise and fall of her chest. This was the legacy I had actually built. It wasn't found in old money or inherited titles, but in the persistence to survive and the freedom to choose who belongs in your life. Success isn't measured in contracts or headlines. It's creating an environment where the next generation starts off stronger than you ever could. They tried to prove I was the failure they predicted. Instead, they proved the cost of refusing to grow. While their world shrank into nothing, mine only continued to expand.